may be relevant to this. It might be. So the Jews don't believe Jesus was the Messiah, still wait for him to come back. They're God's chosen people. Much of the challenges that the Jewish have, and when I say challenges, it's the hatred toward them, the response to Hamas going in there, and number one, what Hamas did, that they exist, but then the response by a lot of the world of supporting Palestine, even though Hamas went in there and killed 400 people and paid horrible things that we all would agree. How much of that do you think relates, if any, to their lack of accepting Jesus as the Son of God who came to die for your sins?
Very little. I think, with regard to what goes on in the Middle East right now, the problem in the Middle East has, to some degree, been about religion, but it has always been about land. That's always been the issue in the Middle East, and it will continue to be the issue. And when you start from two basic principles, that the Muslims believe that they are rightfully inheritors of the land by the fact that they will trace their genealogy back even further than what they say should be the genealogy of, in other words, they'll say, look, the line didn't come through Isaac and through Jacob, and subsequently it came from Abraham's first offspring, Ishmael. So their claim is, therefore, all of this belongs to us. Here, the reality is, Palestinians right now, it's a group of disparate people, very disparate people. In fact, a lot of them don't even get along. Some of the things we're going to talk about here. The Palestinians originally were probably from Crete, or what we would recognize. Palestine, the term comes from Palasheth, which originally meant Philistine, and that meant sea peoples. So it hasn't ever really been about, well, let me rephrase that. To some degree it is religion, because there is God Yahweh and there is God Allah. And so to some degree it is. But the real Middle East issue is what's going on with the land. And it always will be. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Have you been surprised at some of the response around the world in these protests supporting Palestine and de facto Hamas in reality?
I have not, actually, and I'll tell you why. Two reasons. One, we're going to talk about today, and that's because of our educational system, which we'll spend some time on here. The second is this. I think once somebody starts digging into this, I think you're going to find that the seeds of what we're seeing, not only here but in the rest of the world, were sown before the Hamas invasion ever even happened. I think you're going to find that there were already people planting Palestinian support seeds from that point on. And what it really comes down to, when you think about it, is this, and most of where you're seeing it come from is our college campuses and a few other areas, but most of that comes from what we've talked about before, the oppressor and the oppressed. And the oppressed has been viewed as the Palestinians and the oppressor as the Jews. So I can't say I'm surprised at all to see. I'm a little surprised in how much there is, but I'm not surprised in the reaction. Any others?
One of the other thoughts is that there is a huge oil and gas supply that's recently been found off the coast, and that's been playing with this as well.
That we'll find that's part of it. We'll find also the part of it is Saudi Arabia was getting dangerously close to normalizing relationships with Israel, which nobody's ever heard of before. So the power behind the throne, in this case, the power behind the Palestinians, the Houthis, Hezbollah, has always been Iran and will continue to be Iran. And there's a common phrase around that Iran will fight the battle to the very last Palestinian. In other words, they're going to get other people to do their work for them. So, and we're going to touch on a couple of those things here that I think you'll find interesting.
Very germane question, I'm glad I asked it.
No, I think it is. Yep. But here's the real question. Why did we even spend time on culture and its relation to today's Christian? Why bother? I mean, what's the purpose behind it? We've been doing this now for 4 months, so why? And I'm going to give you two reasons. By the way, if you didn't get them, the notes that you have will have these in them. The first one is this. There was a young writer, well, I can't tell you how young, I guess that's relational. Everything to me looks pretty young anymore. There's a young writer who writes for the Christian Post that wrote an extensive article on why Christians should be involved in what he called the culture wars. And he wrote it for something called the Christian Post. I know, he's a pastor and a writer, but probably his biggest accomplishment in my estimation is the fact that he's from my alma mater. He graduated from Liberty. And here, let me tell you what he said. When he wrote this article, he gave a number of reasons why the Christians should be involved. He called it the culture war, but he makes a good point about, I don't care if you want to call it the culture war or call it something else. Here's why Christians should be involved. And he gives a number of reasons, and he gets to the last reason. And the last reason was basically this. I'm going to read the quote here, but I want you to think about this for just a minute. The entire Christian movement was countercultural. Not? Jesus and his 12 disciples were certainly countercultural, not just to the Roman times, but to the Jewish times. So listen to what Justin Steckbauer writes. Finally, for the past 2,000 years, the gospel has served to transform cultures and to remake cultures. Maybe we don't like the term war and don't like the idea of Christians fighting. Well, then don't use those words. Think of it in terms of transforming and renewing a broken culture. That's the first of the reasons, and that's going to come from the Christian standpoint. But let's listen to something from what I would have to term as probably one of the most non-Christian, well, I would guess one of the most non-Christian sources there is. And I've talked about this before. A Chinese warlord by the name of Sun Tzu, in the 5th century BC, wrote something called The Art of War. Listen to what he says. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So why study culture as it relates to cultural issues and how it relates to Christians today? If nothing else, we need to know who we're dealing with. And that's been the purpose behind why we did the 8 different groupings that we kind of did. Now, we're going to end this up appropriately in David Jeremiah's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Well, first, that's some general principles, and then I'm going to deal with 3 specific principles, and then we're going to bring all of this to kind of a closure for the day. David Jeremiah, I think it's appropriate since he wrote the book, Where Do We Go From Here? David Jeremiah says this as he closes his book. Where do we go from here? Whenever I write, I pray for God's power on every word. But when I quote the word of God, I know there is limitless power in every syllable. In other words, he's differentiating between what he's writing and what the scripture says. He's saying, I pray for guidance, but when I'm quoting scripture, I know there's limitless power. So I would like to highlight 5 passages directly from the book of Colossians that will tell you where to go from here. And then he gives 5 different passages, all from the book of Colossians, which is one of the books we're going to study here in a few minutes. And I'm just going to give you a little kind of a vignette in each one of these that he writes about. Naomi Reed interviewed an Asian Christian named Resham, who told his story. I have Parkinson's disease now. Now he's quoting Resham. I can't walk anymore, and I'm mostly in my bed. I can't leave this room or go to church or visit people. It's a change for me. I spent my whole adult life sharing the gospel back then. Back then, I walked through 72 districts in Nepal, preaching the gospel, and we started a Bible correspondence course. In total, we've had 700,000 students. He goes on to relate now, because of Parkinson's disease, he can't do anything, but he can still talk. I want to be like Paul, he says. I know that he used all his energy to share the gospel right to the end, and I want to do that too. I don't have any energy in my body anymore, but I still have energy in my heart and my mind. Even now, people can still ring me on the phone and ask about me. So the first principle that David Jeremiah says is, preach the gospel with your lips. And he quotes Colossians 1:28. Him we preach. So the first principle is, speak like Rosham. Here's the second. Picture the gospel with your life. When twin brothers, Brett and Alex Harris, were teenagers, they wrote a book titled Do Hard Things. They suggested readers get up early, do more than required, find a cause, and be better than our culture. They wrote as Christians. Both boys finished high school at age 16, clerked with Alabama Supreme Court, and organized political campaigns. And it goes on to tell a little bit about the rest of them. And then they quote one of the brothers, I think this is Alex, in a interview that he had. And this is him. We ultimately do hard things, and we have the power to do hard things, Alex said in an interview, because Jesus Christ has done the ultimate hard thing. He died on the cross, beating sin and death forever for our sakes. And because of that, we have this incredible hope. We have this incredible security. We have this incredible understanding that failure is not the end, and our own failures do not negate this faithfulness. And he kind of ends by this, Jeremiah ends by this, because he's talking about walking. So the verse from Colossians he uses when it says, picture the gospel with your life. As you in Colossians 2:6, by the way, all of these should be in your notes. As you therefore have received Jesus Christ as Lord, so walk. I want you to notice what it says. It doesn't say walk with him, does it? It says walk in him. The Harris brothers walked. Here's what David Jeremiah says about that term. Walk is a term that is used often to describe the Christian life. In Colossians 2:6, the word is in the present tense, indicating an ongoing process. Walking implies a steady step-by-step effort and progress toward a goal. In other words, our actions are to consistently align with our words and beliefs. We preach the gospel with our lips, and we picture the gospel with our lives. Francis of Assisi, I've quoted him a number of times before, the one who said, preach the gospel always, use words if you have to. So the second principle is picture the gospel with your life or as you walk. Here's the third one. Ponder the gospel with your mind. The gospel of Jesus Christ informs not only our actions, but also our thoughts. Colossians 3 begins with some of the most positive words ever written. Since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven and not the things of earth. Excuse me. Jeremiah goes on to quote famous preacher Henry Ward Beecher, and he said this. He said that Henry Ward Beecher once said, the soul without imagination is what an observatory would be without a telescope. Excuse me. Moses and the 70 elders saw the foundation of the Lord's throne. Ezekiel and Isaiah saw the throne of God. Stephen saw Jesus standing at the right side of the throne. John saw it in the book of Revelation. All these writers described what they saw, and that allows us to use our God-given imagination to see, as best we can by faith, the same throne of grace. Slight pause. Don't worry about it. I took a COVID test, not COVID, so that only leaves tuberculosis. Excuse me. So, the third principle, ponder the gospel with your mind. Here's the fourth principle. Practice the gospel with your love. And here's what David Jeremiah says about that. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt issued a remarkable statement to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. For 18 hours between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, a white mob attacked a predominantly black neighborhood in Tulsa, killing hundreds of people and leaving thousands homeless. The story is soul-wrenching to study, but for decades, few people knew about it. News outlets didn't report it in those days. So the governor of Oklahoma, Stitt, and this must have been 2021, he's recognizing it and he talks about it. And then here's what he says, to get over the pain. It is our responsibility that peace and love are taught in our homes, schools, workplace, and churches. God commands this of us in Colossians 3:14 and 15. Above all, clothe yourself with love, which binds us together in perfect harmony, and let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as a member of one body, you are called to live in peace. So the fourth principle that David Jeremiah takes from the books of Colossians in terms of culture and the Christian today is practice the gospel with your love. And then the final one is this, and he just titles it Finish Strong. And let me tell you what he says about this. There are many other instructions for us in the book of Colossians, exhortations for these last days we should take to heart. But I want to end with a strange little verse at the very end of the book. It's a personal message addressed to one individual, to you. Well, he writes on, well, actually, it's to a man named Archippus. But you can put your name in that spot. It says, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. I'm going to read that again. Take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. In other words, finish the work. Complete the task. Make sure by the end of your life you have also come to the end of your assigned earthly task. So the summary is, what's he saying? We can sit by and watch idly, or we can deal with some of the things, some of the issues that we've talked about over the last weeks. Now, how do you do that? So I hopefully have some practical examples here. So we've gone from what I'm going to call the general to some specifics, and I picked 3 specifics. Well, actually, I didn't pick 3 specifics. I let some of you pick 3 specifics. Some of you got an email from me saying, if you had to pick out of the 8 or 9, I think there are 9 total if you add social media, out of the subjects we've talked about, tell me the 3 that you think have the greatest effect or the most impact on the culture today. A few of you responded, and the response was pretty interesting. The number 1, anybody want to guess what number 1 was? Pardon? Yep. Number 1 was social media and the internet. Number 2, and they kind of varied. Everyone had a little bit different take on it. Number 2 was parents' role in education. But Jeff made a very good point. This shouldn't be an issue of just parents' role in education. It should be, what's the impact education's having on our society? So I've kind of moved towards a little bit more towards that direction. And number 3 was gender and sexuality. One of the responders responded this way. He thought the biggest issue was this: silence and apathy of the church. So let's deal with those 3. First of all, that's the survey. Now, first of all, social media and the internet. And 2 of the, what I think are the most telling slides in this whole presentation The first had to do with kind of the development of the internet and how it came about. But then you remember we talked about the impact that it had and the millions of people that we find on social media today, and each one of those sites that you look at. That I thought was interesting in itself, but the thing that just I think is even more flabbergasting should be this one. You'll probably remember this slide. On your left, as you face it, is those who turn to social media for their news, not necessarily just for chatting and stuff, but for their news. On the right-hand side, network and cable TV news. And the differentiation is, on the right-hand side, you see the darker green. That's pretty much our generation. I mean, on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, the group that you see, that's pretty much the, I think it's probably the millennials or Gen Z, in other words, from 1997 till later. So not only is the media having a major effect on what's going on in our culture, but the younger generations are taking most of their news from social media. And I made the point before that media in general is not exempt from being biased. In fact, I would point out a number of places that you'll find bias in what I'm calling the traditional media today. The difference is at least there is some guardrails for that. In social media, at least so far, there's absolutely no guardrails. Will there be? Maybe. Should there be? I don't know. I guess I'm a big enough believer in free speech that I believe if you're stupid enough to believe what somebody has written without checking it out, then you deserve what you get. Well, that didn't sound very Christian, did it? So, social.
It's fair, though.
So social media and the internet, and I'm going to make 4 points, general points. And by the way, I will send you a revised bibliography that has the links to sites that I've added, mostly as a result of this session, but I'll send you a revised bibliography, and I suggest you go on some of these sites, because this first one, this is actually a secular site. This first one talks about makes 4 points. And it's from 4 ways your social media is controlling you and how to overcome them. Now, this isn't related to kids. We're going to get to kids here in just a minute. This is related to us. And as I read through these, I'm going, holy smokes, how did they know I was doing all this stuff? Here's the first one. You know the comedian that says, you might be a redneck if, and then he goes on to say, if you do this and this and this. This is kind of the same thing. You might have a problem if, and then it goes on to say, studies show that social media platforms can be addictive and cause mental distress. Now, I'm just going to give you 3 of the points that they make about this. I think there's 3. How often do you find yourself opening apps and scrolling through your feeds while waiting for a meeting or something else? In other words, a little time, what do? Grab your phone or your computer and kind of scroll through. Here's the second. Do you pick up your phone the moment it buzzes? Even if you're supposed to be mentally present at a business dinner. Now remember, this site is kind of geared towards the business community, but the points are still the same for all of us. Here's the third. If you're checking your apps multiple times a day, or find yourself anxious that you didn't respond to an alert fast enough, there's a good chance that you're doing it out of habit, meaning you're not in control. So they go on to say, well, what's the solution? This is both for us and kids. And then I'm going to deal a bit with kids here in just a minute. The solution to this first item is set limits. Lock access after a certain amount of time. Put phone in do not disturb. Consciously avoid boredom scrolling. You know, and some of you have probably been in the same situation. Yesterday or the day before, I forget when it was, Deborah asked me to run an errand for her. So I went out and I jumped in the pickup and I took off down the street, and my dashboard tells me, you're not connected. I left my phone at home. I turned around, went back and got the phone. Now, tell me you've never done that, and I will probably call you a liar.
Haven't done it today.
So, the solutions are, and by the way, the same solutions are for kids as well. But let me hit the other 4 points that this site talks about. You may have a problem if you're sharing information that may not be true. Let me give you a perfect example of that. Last week, do you remember the great espionage and car bombing at the Canadian border? Do you remember that? The news said terrorists are trying to crash the Canadian border. And man, you could not find a channel anywhere that didn't talk about that. What was the truth? Do you recall? They still don't know why, but it turned out to be a couple who either the accelerator got stuck or something. A couple from New York who'd been there forever and ever and ever, have no relationship as far as anyone knows to any extremists. The car somehow accelerated, went airborne, and hit something and just blew up. Yet, I will guarantee you can probably go today and you'll probably still find news sources that say they were extremist terrorists. So, pardon?
It set off a bomb.
Yeah, that's right. So the first is you're sharing information that may not be true. Here's the second. You're stuck in an echo chamber. Actually, before I do that, I want to go back to some solutions for sharing information that may not be true. The first thing is, and we've mentioned this before, and I've told you, check credentials. Go find out who wrote an article. Find out what their background is, where it came from, what their worldview is. Secondly, check other news sources for corroboration. And thirdly, just give it some time. You know, by the time you see most things come across the headlines, any part of the news that's going to be there is done in the first 5 minutes until it gets corrected later on. But in the meantime, you know what you get? Interviews from everybody down to the janitor who is 3 blocks away who thought he heard something. So check other news sources for credentials and then give it some time before you say, this is what I think. The third one is this: you're stuck in an echo chamber. What does that mean? An echo chamber means we tend to listen to the same people that we agree with. We don't listen to opposing views, do we?
Not very often.
No. We tend to go see who it is that's saying the same thing we're saying and then say, see, they're right. Well, what is that? Excuse me. What does that eventually do? It just turns out to be people saying the same thing over and over to the same people that had the same thoughts in mind. Jeff, do me a favor. There should be some red cups in the drawer back there. Would you give me a little glass of water and see if I can quell my tuberculosis? The second part of that is challenge others in the echo chamber. Somebody comes out and says something to you and say, well, wait a minute, where did you get that? And then let me give you the fourth one, or the fourth reason that it's an issue. You're comparing yourself to others. How often have we looked at something on, say, the internet or something and said, man, that would be good, man, I'd like to do that, or this is interesting, or you'll have to talk to the good Mrs. Cummins about the time she spends on Pinterest, and then you'll know where most of these desserts come from. So what's the alternative? You know, what do we do about this? Well, I've given you a couple of links here, and the links will show up, but I've given you some alternatives. There are at least 7 Christian social media sites, and pureflix.com wrote an article about 7 Christian media sites you can try today. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah. Wait, I might have a mask for you. You want a mask? And the second is, you'll find another site called the 60 Best Christian News Websites in 2023. The links to both of those will be on what I send out later today. Now, we've dealt with us. Well, what about the kids? And I want to note just 3 things. And this is all related to social media. The first is this: realize that developing brains may be especially vulnerable to specific social media features. Adolescent brain development generally starts before puberty, around age 10, and lasts through early adulthood. Deborah's had a number of phone conversations with our youngest daughter, whose oldest son just turned 10. Part of it, I'm sure, is Deborah's going, okay, now you know what it was like for me. She never says that to Sarah, but she's dealing with that period of time. The problem with that is that in early adolescence, brain regions associated with desire for attention from peers becomes increasingly sensitive. Social media may exploit that desire. Meanwhile, brain areas important for self-control don't fully develop until early adulthood. There's a gap there, isn't there? From the time of 10 to, and some of us don't ever get self-control, development of self-control parts of our brain. But there's certainly a gap from 10 years of age to early adulthood. So what does that mean? Well, then that means there must be some kind of guidance for someone using social media where we just saw how they're going to be influenced. So the article suggests this: monitor and discuss social media use with your kids. Secondly, there are programs out there, and I gave you 3 of them: Aura, Bark, Norton. It's actually Check Norton with a little check mark. And those apps can monitor gaming app use. They can set time limits on how long the kid can be doing his social media. They also have, most of them have a way for dealing with bullying. So that's the second thing, bullying.
Bullying.
Yep. The third one is this, and this affects what we talked about with us earlier: model healthy social media use. If you expect your kid to do something differently than what you're doing, your expectations are wrong. In other words, if they see you on your social media 24/7, what do you think they're going to do? So that's our first topic. Here's our second: education in America. And as I said, I've kind of expanded this somewhat to not just parents' role, but what's the issue with education that we see today? That was the second highest ranked in my little survey. And here's if you were to go try to do some kind of search saying, what's the problem with American education today? I'll tell you what you're going to find. The first 100 or so out of the thousands of websites are all going to say, we need more money. We need more funding. We need more. Here's the catch term. Yeah, but the catch term is always this: we need more resources. Let me, in Greek and Hebrew, resources means money. So I thought I'd just check and see. And here's what I found. The average annual per student funding in public education, this is both elementary and high school. I didn't deal with secondary education here. Across the country, per student is $17,013 per year per student. The average annual private funding per year per student is $12,326. Yet the National Assessment of Education Progress says that 4th and 8th graders perform 20 points higher in private schools than they do in public schools, and the SATs in private schools are consistently higher than those in public schools. So we'll probably have to deal with this whole issue of it takes more money. It does not take. If it isn't more money, what could it be? I'm going to come to that here in just a minute. What I added last night is I got to thinking, well, gosh, we've dealt with public schools and private schools. How do you find out about homeschools? Because homeschools are such an amorphous group. How do you even know what's going on in it? Listen to what I found. The average cost per year per homeschooler, $700 to $2,800 per year. Now, that's typically buying package, and you can find a lot of good packaged curricula anymore for homeschoolers. So that probably represents those kind of costs, because obviously you've got your house or wherever else you're teaching them. So I don't think it's probably the issue of not having the resources that way. I think it may be more what Kathleen brought up, which is that parent going to be disciplined enough to make sure that the education is taking place? Well, we have to think they're doing something right, because the same site said homeschoolers performed 15 to 30% higher on standardized tests than public school students, and scored considerably higher on SATs and ACTs. So if the problem isn't funding, what is it? Well, could it be what is being taught? And we've talked about what's being taught. These are general principles. I can't say go to Park Elementary and you'll find all of these things. Across the board, though, here's the things that we're seeing in schools today. Critical race theory, and we made a whole point about that in the South Carolina election. Gender issues, which we also talked about. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here's another one of my favorite slides in our grouping of slides. Do you remember this one? We talked about this. How does the guy in the purple shirt get the bigger box? Well, if the guy in the red shirt says, here, I want you to have my box so you can see the game, that's fine with me. But if you come and take my box away and give it to the guy in the purple shirt, that's called equity. So critical race theory, gender issues, diversity, equity, inclusion, all those are being taught from elementary on. Let's take a closer look. We're probably thinking, well, that's out there. Well, let's take a closer look. I didn't look at Durango 9R because, frankly, I'm not sure how I go about finding it, but I did go to Fort Lewis. And you can get their catalog if you want to. You can go to Fort Lewis. And so let's look a little closer to home and see some of the things being taught there. Now, again, it's probably not fair to compare secondary education with higher education. But here's what I found. First of all, you can get a BA in gender and sexuality studies. So you can get a degree in it.
Great job prospects on that.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the first questions you learn is, do you want fries with that? There is a class called GSS 300. The title of the class is Masculinities. Let me give you the description of the class. This interdisciplinary course, this comes straight out of the Fort Lewis catalog, moves away from the axiom that masculinity is exclusively aligned with men.
Who wrote that?
The professor.
Students will examine the ways in which ideas of masculinity have been utilized by different populations to create structures of power and thought, to organize societies, to perform gender and transgress traditional notions of masculinity. In other words, female masculinities. This seminar emphasizes critical thinking and independent research.
I would think you were making that up. I would think better.
I'll give you the link to there's a bunch of others that you won't believe.
Like if I said, hey, make up something crazy about a curriculum of Fort Lewis, I thought that's what you'd come up with.
Let me,
And don't you think that private, I want to hear Kathleen's opinion, like private high schools or private schools, don't you think they typically have higher scores because the kids that go there come from higher income families where parents care more? You have less of issue than you have in lower income issues of families.
probably, I don't know if all of you heard that, but Keith's question was, wouldn't you think that people in private schools do better because they come from more affluent backgrounds or places where the parent takes an active role in the student's education? I think the second of those two is even more important, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of vouchers here in just a minute. But Kathleen, you are directly tasked.
Uh-oh. I think it's really complex. I think part of it is ratios. You know, in the public education system, you might have 30 to 1. In private, it might be 12 to 1.
Good point.
Homeschooling is 1 to 1 sometimes, 1 to 2. And so it's ratios, it's relationships. how relationships are built. I think it's complex when you say that more affluent people go to private schools. Most private schools have a equity clause where they have to offer so many scholarships or whatever. But it pretty much comes down to involvement, whether you're a high-income parent or a low-income parent. Some of my best parents were my really poor Mexican parents because they really cared about their kids' education.
So I guess the point would be pretty much what I said. Probably if I were to pick one of the most important pieces, it would be involvement of the parent in the child's education.
Yeah, whether they're educated or not.
Yep.
It's what they want for their kids.
Let me give you the second class from.
That's probably true in early education. I'm not sure that's that big of a deal in secondary, in higher education, college.
I believe it is, but I think kids have more of a choice,
I
right?
mean,
As they
like
become adults.
parental involvement.
I think parental involvement's there, it's the child has more say and choice, is my thought.
If you're going to college, if you choose to go to college as a student, then like everyone has to go to high school. You don't have to go to college. So if you're choosing to go to college, you kind of go on that path. Like I told my daughter, if you don't have a really good GPA, I'm not paying you for that. I'm not.
So I was chastised by somebody who watches. I'm amazed at how many people watch these things. Thanks.
You have a bunch of followers. Tom.
I know, I'm an influencer. But her complaint was she can't hear from some of the people in the audience when they're talking, so let me just summarize kind of the discussion about higher education. And Jeff, your point was that in elementary and secondary, the parent's role is much greater, and I think that's an accurate statement. But overall, even in higher education, you know where the parent has the most effect? Well, first of all, do you know that a person's entire personality is formed by the time they're 5 years old? So who has the effect on the formation of that personality? Should be the parent, shouldn't it? So then the way they have influence in higher education, the parent has influence in higher education, is having prepared that kid to make the right choice once they get there and helping them to make the right choice. But I think there should still be involvement. But I'm anxious to get to the second class. I want you to hear about the second class. This is from, this is called the Peace and Conflict Studies minor. So you can get a minor in Peace and Conflict Studies. And the course is titled 325 Middle Eastern Policies. Let me read you the description. An examination of the forces shaping the governments and politics of modern Arab states in North Africa and Southwest Asia. The emphasis on Islam, Islamist politics, regional geopolitics, and current economic, natural resources and social issues affecting the Arab world. Do you find anything puzzling about that description? How many times do you hear me say the word Arab? Yet this is supposed to be a study on Middle East politics. So I looked it up. The largest socioeconomic group in the region, this is the region, social economic groups in the region are Arabs, Turks, Persians, who most of us would call Iranians, Kurds, and Azerbaijanis. None of those people get along. But there are dozens of other ethnic groups that have hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of members, and it gives some other ones. Other indigenous, religious, or minority ethnic groups include Assyrians, Armenians, Balak, Coptic Christians, Cappadocian Greeks, Cypriots, Druze, Gaelics, Greeks, Jews. In other words, you can't say this is a study on Middle Eastern politics and limit it only to Arabs. So what do you think is being taught, Keith, in a class that focuses on what's going on in Arab politics, especially when it says regional geopolitics and current economic, natural resources, and social issues affecting the Arab world. What's being taught is, now I will make a huge leap here because I have yet to take the course. I'm going to sign up for both of these.
I would love to do that.
It is not going to happen. But so where do you think the focus is going to be? It will be on the Palestinian conflict. It will be on kind of Arabs as a general group. But the real issue is, and they don't hide anything about it here, it's going to be on Islam and Islamist politics. If this is a true study on the Middle East, why isn't there also a study on Jewish and Jewish politics? Why isn't there a study on Coptics and Coptic politics? So you can't intellectually honestly say this is a study on Middle Eastern politics. Those are the kind of things that are just, well, from my house, a stone's throw away. So what's the solution? Well, possibly, there's three, possibly homeschooling, possibly private schools, and we talked about that. School choice, the ability to take your tax dollar and put it in a private school or some other school of some type. Those two are certainly important, but I think Kathleen had exactly the right point, and the writer that we talked about when we did this study had exactly the right point, is even if you don't do that, get involved in public schools. Run for the school board, volunteer at the school. Even if you continue to be in the public schools, we need, as Christians, to be able to have some influence on what's being taught there.
Tom, does it say what major or what jobs you get with those majors?
No.
Well, it would be blank for that one versus like accounting would be.
Well, I think probably with any of these, gender and sexuality studies, where are you going to go? You pretty much, what are you going to end up in? You're probably going to end up in education someplace.
Well, this one says political science. The peace and conflict is a minor in political science.
Yeah.
And then a BA in genders and sexuality. So it's a Bachelor of Arts. So it's got a track somewhere. It's just
Yeah.
your choice in that track.
I think you'd be interested, and you can find them if you just go and type in for those. They give you their catalog. Just go look at a list of the classes. It's pretty interesting.
Okay, so coming back to this poli-sci, why don't you offer to teach a class that gives all the points you just brought up? Do that 1 or 2 days a week.
I'd be happy to. I'll tell you why. They're not going to hire me.
Okay, you're too white? Too
No. It's going to have to do with worldview. The minute I send my resume in there,
Yeah.
and they say Masters in Biblical Studies and Masters in Christian Education, I'm not going to get an interview.
You don't know that.
Well, I'll try it. Yeah, I'm up for that. If you guys are up for that, I'll do it. I'm going to send in my resume with a nice letter. I'll do that.
I'll sign up for the class.
We'll take the class if you teach it.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the good thing about recording this is I can show Fort Lewis and I can say, look, we already have 2 tuition sources right here.
Yeah, they need students.
It sounds like you have a homework assignment.
Here's, I got a question too. I think one thing that and this is off tangent, but Marxist regimes get it right in the sense that, once they identify, I mean, I know it's selection, and so forth, but they focus on that child at an early age, because they can indoctrinate how they want them to think and so forth. Obviously, I'm thinking of Cuba, which would have happened to me, but also the Chinese, the same way as well too. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw it in.
Well, and Ernie's point was, and we talked a little bit about this, this is called social Marxism, which is from one to another, from one who has the ability to another who doesn't. Who are we most influenced by when we're in early, let's call it early childhood education? Who are we most influenced by? Hopefully parents. Who's probably next on the list? Teachers. I can tell you, I was definitely influenced by Sister Mary Ernest Borgnine. Now, That's a joke. It was actually Sister Mary Baptista was her name, but she was,
Like her as poor daughter.
man, she was like 6'4" and 225. She was a big, big woman. She had an incredible influence on my life.
On your backside.
Yeah, that's right. Are we not influenced? Isn't that where we get a lot of our influence, in those ages?
And TV.
And TV. And apparently now, social media. Now, we need to get to our third one, though. Gender and sexuality. And I want to make sure, first of all, I do have to point out something. I read an article the other day that there is apparently, this is not one big happy group. There's becoming a huge schism between the L and the G's on one side and the BTQ pluses on the other side. And the L's and the G's are saying, don't put us in with the rest of that group. One of the biggest proponents of that is Martina Navratilova, who's in the L group that says men shouldn't be competing with women in anything. So there's getting to be a huge schism. And for us to look at this as probably a one homogeneous group is probably homogeneous is not the right term for it. It's probably not accurate to do. So the first thing is, but the point I wanted to make was this, and I think, Ernie, we determined later that number 5.6 is probably closer to 7%. The point is still this: when does 7% of any organization drive the conversation the way it's been driven in the United States in the past 20 years? There's something more behind it, and we talked about what those were. Media influences, some of the other influences. Here's the second point, and I want you need to take this home with you, put it up on your refrigerator so you know the differences between what gender is, what cisgender is, what gender queer is, and what non-binary is. Those were some of the things we studied. So the first issue is blurring the lines. That's where we are today in terms of, this is very simple because the Bible is going to tell us. It's in Genesis. He made man and he made woman, and that's it. There are two. So the first issue is blurring the lines. And I'm going to summarize this by saying, where is this all coming from? And you might recall, I did a little research on the NEA, and I looked at some of the offerings and trainings that they did, and I picked one of the newest ones that came out, and I'm just going to read the description of it, and then we're going to get to the end of this whole class. New, by request, this module is designed to help educators create safe learning spaces for students who identify as transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming. This module is important and timely as trans youth come under attack in state legislatures across the country. This new module explains the terminology related to queer identities and shares ways to support students who are transitioning, highlighting specific challenges and needs of BIPOC students, BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and more. And in the module, you'll get also diversity and inclusion, gender equity, and discussions about LGBTQ+. That's one of the modules that you'll find, and you can get it. I can get it. I don't think I even have to be a member. Well, I might have to be a member. I don't know. You can get the module for what they give schools, and I assume, Kathleen, you made the point that sometimes funding's related to this.
And I'm not sure about this one. This kind of came, I was kind of new into all this
Yeah.
when I left.
And, if you think about it, most of what we talked about has been in the last 10 years, or at least come to light in the last 10 years. So the summary to this discussion is what I just said a minute ago. The issue was settled a long time ago. In Genesis 1:27, God created man and he created woman. There are two.
Amen.
Now, let me summarize all of this. I'm going to summarize it from Joe Dallas's book. Joe Dallas, Christians in a cancel culture and speaking the truth and grace in a hostile world. And I told you he was has a master's in Christian counseling. He's the American Association of Christian Counselors, and he has something called Genesis Counseling. But he also had a sordid past before he came to Christ. So I'm going to relate what he called one last stand. This is the end of his book, by the way. We must always take sides. Nobel laureate Eric Weissel said, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentors, never the tormented. And then that was a quote from Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel. He goes on to say, this is Joe Dallas talking now, we're not asking for a fight. On the contrary, most of the tensions in America between the church and culture come from the culture trying to tell the church what to say or do, not vice versa. However strongly we may feel about issues, we're not the ones going on social media trying to silence people, or on Amazon trying to ban books, or on college campuses shouting down speakers we disagree with. We've sought to converse, not coerce. So taking sides in something is something many of us have been reluctant to do. He's talking about Christians here. When you take sides, you define. And when you define, you can alienate. So in some institutions, you'll choose not to alienate by not taking a stand. There can be wisdom in that, unless the issue is vital. Conscience is at stake, and you find yourself remembering that if you're ashamed of his words, he'll somehow be ashamed of you. Here's what he's quoting there, by the way. He's quoting Luke 9:26, and Jesus says this, whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. You'll notice what he said, who's ashamed of the Son of Man and of his words. That's what he's talking about here. So unless the issue is vital, conscience is at stake, and you find yourself remembering that if you're ashamed of his words, he'll someday be ashamed of you, then when Weisel's advice, that's when Weisel's advice on taking sides resonates. And then he's going to give us an example of how that occurred in his life. And he talks about, he went to a party, he and his wife went to a party, this is, I think he said 30 years ago, after he had become a Christian, went to a party because he had a friend who was a gay friend. It was a birthday party for him. And when he got there, he was kind of excoriated by some of the people. So I'm going to relate that event to you. Another drunken guest shouted out, oh, I was raised Baptist, and all you people are, expletive deleted. Yet another said, I'm Mormon, but I guess I'm not doing it right, which we laughingly agreed with. Then the attorney said, the one who started all this, hey, everybody, let's all say what we think about God and religion. I'd really like to hear this. Well, it's kind of surprising. He goes on to say, same gay pool party this is turning out to be. So this is Joe Dallas talking again, I thought. But amazingly, one guest after another offered their views on spirituality, spiritually very freely, and I must say very respectfully. Then it was Renee's turn, Renee's his wife. She gave her testimony about hearing the gospel, being saved, navigating some rough times in life, and learning to lean on the Lord. Sounds like you're both Jerry Falwell's people, someone said, while a couple of the women playfully threatened to throw Renee into the pool, I guess to rebaptize her, I'm not sure. She grinned like a good sport. Then it was my turn. And here's what he said. You know, Jerry Falwell had nothing to do with my decision. I said, I had to look at what Scripture says about life and family, and I knew what I had to choose. So I chose, and I found peace. And it isn't choice something we all value? I never chose to be attracted to men for sure, but I did choose what to do with my attractions. You know what? I'm glad I did it. And then he summarizes by saying, taking sides was called for. In doing so, we alienated some, amused others, and won others over to a better understanding of faith. We hadn't come to take positions, but when put on the spot, We had to. And his point was, we had no choice but to give the Lord's word. And then he finishes it up by saying, while it's still light, the window of opportunity to openly speak truth is closing. That doesn't mean we'll stop speaking it, but we'll soon meet barriers and dangers that aren't in place now. We're already doing that, aren't we? Aren't we already meeting those? So now's the time to, as Jesus said, work the works of him who sent me and us while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. If there's a right position to take, we have limited time to take it freely because a lot has changed in the 30-plus years since that reasonably friendly pool party. The movement to stop all communication of unacceptable views is now worldwide and popular. A modern Goliath following threats and daring anyone to challenge him. Too many of us won't, for reasons that are understandable, but not legitimate. So let's go back to the beginning of this class. Why did we do it? What's the purpose? And the best way to summarize it, I think, is what Sun Tzu said. Know your enemy, know yourself. And the Laos are, you've done everything but get in the starting blocks to,
I have to work at night.
I understand. So do this for me. Do a closing prayer.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh. Lord, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for Tom and his, just his dedication to showing what you would love us to know, and also his due diligence in